And here we are. It is episode 74.
How is my new microphone right now? I'm trying it out for this podcast.
I think it sounds good.
Okay, that's good.
Hmm.
And the irony is, I don't know if I'm going to be doing much of the talking right now because it's daylight savings times here in the United States. It's aside from the fact that it's International Women's Day, it's not a really favorite time of year at all. Uh, um,
Is, isn't that great that we're having an
but
episode on International Women's Day? That's right.
yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, of course. Yeah, it is of course for that reason I don't feel my best right now.
Well, in celebration of International Women's Day, I wasn't planning to talk about it at all. I've got various other
hmm
things I was going to talk about, but I regarded it as sufficiently unimportant that I didn't even put it on my agenda.
hmm Right.
But I actually, so I guess I've already said episode 74. One of the things I actually do want to talk about, though, actually, which is
hmm
kind of, well, relates to feminism and Marxism and a few other things, is the nuclear family. So, interestingly enough, I've been encountering recently quite a few people who believe that the nuclear family is a relatively recent invention. Now, this is something that people in the past, some people have been taught in women's studies and so forth. But I would have thought most people would have sort of figured that out by now that it's not the case and that historically the nuclear family actually has a long history. But no, of course they're still stuck in the past and they don't realise that this is the case. So, but I just thought I'd briefly mention just a few points about the nuclear family.
Sure.
Um, so first thing I want to just clarify is that so we and I must admit, even I was taught this, I think, quite early on, that they would say something like, oh, instead of the nuclear family, historically, most societies had extended families. But really, the two aren't mutually exclusive. So I'll define them really quickly, though. So a nuclear family is essentially, generally speaking, a mother and a father and some children who are growing up. And then when they grow up, become adults, they leave home and they get married and they start their own family, and on the process goes, right? An extended family would involve people of multiple generations living together. So grandparents, maybe even great grandparents in some cases, all living together. And you might have had a couple of pairs of grandparents, perhaps, on a very large house. Now that certainly did happen, and I think probably perhaps even more among aristocracies and so forth, where you might see if they're in a mansion or something, you might see a very large number of people living there. But the reality is, if you look at the historical record, not every society, but if you look at a lot of societies, and if you look even at, say, hunter-gatherers today, to give you an example, other societies today, the nuclear family is a very common thing that exists in many different societies. I was thinking of a few different examples. So I'm a bit of an amateur genealogist, and while I was thinking about this, I was actually thinking about some of the family research I've done. And it's probably not too surprising if I mention mostly Irish ancestry. It's probably not too surprising to mention that I do have some English ancestry. And in actual fact, I had direct line ancestors who were living in London through the middle of the 20th century, sorry, middle of the 19th century. And they were actually present in the first, I believe it was the first census in the UK, which was 1840. And then there was one again in 1850 and 1860 and so forth. In those three, I had direct line ancestors who were living in London, and sometime after 1860, they moved to Australia. So, interestingly enough, if you look at the entry, do you know what it has? It has a father, whatever his name, can't recall the gentleman's
Mhm.
first name, but his surname was Brockway, and his wife, and several children, four or five children, right? And and there might have been, an elderly relative living with them or something like that.
Mhm.
But and if you look at other entries from around the same time, this is what you see. People in the 19th century were living in nuclear families. I'm just seeing, as I said, I keep seeing this claim that it's even a post-World War II invention, which is just bizarre. But this is something feminists are now continuing to talk about. But I just want to really emphasize that nuclear families, as I said, have been really common historically, and all around the world. And it doesn't necessarily, as I said, preclude the extended family. So what was a very common arrangement would be, a nuclear family living in a house. And what I want to make clear here is that they're living in a single dwelling, right? You've got the mother and the father and the kids living in a dwelling together. And maybe there's an elderly relative they're caring for, but that alone doesn't make an extended family. What you probably would find is nearby, there were a lot of relatives in the same village or perhaps the same
Hmm.
area of the city or whatever. So, but the key is they were living in a dwelling as a nuclear family, even though they had support from, say, relatives and in the same community.
Hmm.
So uh, they've still got that support that you would get from the extended family, but they really were living in a single family dwelling. And
Right.
as I said, this is fairly common. If you look at, say, hunter-gatherer societies from today, I mean, just there's plenty of information available on this today. And what do you see? Time and time again, you see single family dwellings that house about 4 or 5 people,
Hmm.
generally a father and a mother and some kids. And this is a pattern and it probably is a pattern which repeats so much because it's fairly logical for humans to live this way. It provides a lot of advantages.
Hmm.
For one thing, one of the problems, and anybody who's lived with their close relatives of multiple generations could probably attest to this. If you're living with multiple generations in one house, there can be all sorts of challenges, and I'm sure that historically that was probably still the case. But so it probably made sense in many cases to have these sort of smaller dwellings that were easier to manufacture. You'd have a nuclear family, but you'd still have the other relatives close by for support, helping to care for the children and so forth. Anyway, I just wanted to emphasize this because it's just interestingly online. Just recently, I've been encountering a lot of feminists who've been claiming that the nuclear family is a relatively recent invention, and it's just nonsense. Any even a cursory review of their historical record shows that to be the case. Not every society has done this. I've talked about it before with patrilineality and matrilineality and so forth.
Hmm.
So the Masao, for example, I seem to recall they were a matrilineal society. I seem to recall they would tend to live in larger groups. But the nuclear family is very, very common historically. And so I think it's a fairly natural way for humans to live. So anyway,
Right.
I just wanted to emphasize that because
Right.
I'm honestly amazed. I don't have very high expectations of, certain groups that are with certain ideological groups, but I'm still amazed they were still sort of sprouting that sort of nonsense.
Do they usually offer some kind of an alternative, like what was if there wasn't a nuclear family?
They'll generally claim that they lived in extended families, but as I said, and while that is true in some cases, and especially I think with aristocrats, in a lot of cases, I think what was more likely was you had people living close by, as I said, in nuclear families, but
Hmm.
still getting that support. In a sense, they were living in an extended family insofar
Hmm.
as they were constantly with their close relatives. But
Right. Yeah.
nevertheless, the single family dwellings were very common. And I think architecturally, probably and engineering wise, probably a lot easier to construct as well.
Hmm.
So, because a lot of people, a lot of humans through much of history lived in single room homes, so,
Hmm.
and the entire family would sort of sleep in one room and eat in that room and so forth. So, building larger structures was also more difficult, and the more people you put into them, it's in general would just be a lot easier to build a series of smaller structures too.
Hmm.
So, I think from a practical point of view, this was
Yeah.
also probably fairly common. But yeah, that's generally what they claimed that it was extended families. Whereas I think the evidence is pretty clear if you look at the historical record that nuclear families,
Hmm.
even those living close to their close relatives, were very common.
Yeah, yeah, but my question was, the feminists keep on saying that the nuclear family is not anything more than a recent phenomenon. But what do they think was more common?
Yeah, so,
May
so so historically they were claiming that the nuclear family, sorry, the extended family was more common.
Okay, okay, okay.
But
Sorry,
yeah, right.
I
But
misunderstood the question.
that's right. But as we know, this leads on to another point I wanted to talk about actually. As we know, there have been attacks against the nuclear family. This is part of it. See,
Uh,
this idea that it's the reason that the ideologues repeat it to their students and claim that it's a recent invention is to try to delegitimize it, right?
mhm. Right.
But if you look at and I can give you various examples of feminists who have wanted to eliminate the nuclear family. Go even Engels in his writing talks about wanting to. One of the founders of Marxism wants to talks about getting rid of the nuclear family.
Uh,
I was actually saw an interesting example just online today that was discussed, and read a bit about this example myself, and I thought it's really interesting to sort of talk about. So in Israel, there were and are communes called kibbutzim. I don't know if I think we've talked about it in the previous episode. So kibbutzim is the plural, kibbutz is the
Yeah,
singular,
I am
and
familiar with
the
that.
yeah, and the kibbutzim started getting going, I think, late 19th century, but really picked up around the 1920s. And they started out actually as pure socialism. It's actually the
Hmm.
evolution of the kibbutz is actually really interesting. Now, it's actually true. It sounds crazy, but the sources claim this is actually true. Originally, I'm getting off the track a little bit, but I will get back to families in a moment.
Hmm.
Originally, kibbutzniks, that's the people who lived on the kibbutz, shared clothing. They originally didn't want the kibbutzniks to have any individual property at all to the extent of clothing. And apparently, and I'm sorry to have to say this, apparently this extended to underwear.
Hmm. I mean,
So
that would logically follow. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But they seem to have abandoned this idea fairly quickly, especially with the underwear. So,
Right.
and then before long, within a few years, in some cases, people had individual work clothing and so forth. Because I mean, if you think about it, otherwise there's practicalities. Otherwise, you'd be getting all the stuff out of the washing and be looking for sizes all the time, trying to figure out which
Hmm.
clothes you could wear. Right? It's
Exactly.
surely it makes much more sense to just have some individually assigned clothing, even if you want to
Hmm.
claim it's owned by the kibbutz or something. Right? Surely you want to
Right.
assign clothing to people. Right?
Uh-huh.
So anyway, getting back to families. The kibbutzniks introduced something called the Children's House, and the Children's House was remember they were reading Marx and Engels and Engels and so forth, and
Right.
the Children's House was an attempt to minimize, not necessarily destroy completely, but minimize the nuclear family. And children would not be brought up by their individual parents in the kibbutz. Instead, they would all spend their time in the children's house where they were cared for by kibbutzniks who were assigned that job to do, who, by some amazing coincidence, were all women, right? So the women expressed an interest in looking after the children, and essentially the men didn't, right? Um, anyway, so the children would be brought up by these women, and the parents would generally get about 1 hour a day with their own children. So the children did know who their parents were, but they would generally spend only about an hour a day with them.
Hmm.
And this was, to cut a long story short, a spectacular failure. The All the children, like to a person who grew up in the children's houses, rejected the idea.
Hmm.
And many of them stayed to live on in Kibbutzim themselves as they grew up to be adults. And when they had children, they just put their foot down and they said, "We will not have our children in these places." That's how much they hated it.
Hmm.
So the children's houses pretty much lasted a generation, and then yeah. So after that, the children were brought up by the individual families inside the kibbutz. So I had the opportunity to stay on a kibbutz in the early 1990s. Very interesting experience. I stayed
Hmm.
on kibbutz Kfar Bloom, which was in northern Israel. It's actually up in the Hula Valley, which is right up near the Lebanese border. So it's lovely part of the world. I think actually getting off the track a little bit again. I'll bring it back to families. Um, the place is full of eucalyptus trees.
Hmm.
So I'm an Australian, of course, and I am used to my eucalyptus trees. And here I am
Hmm.
in northern Israel, and there's the smell of eucalyptus everywhere, and it was making me homesick,
Hmm.
right? And it turns out that the eucalyptus trees are well adapted to that. It's a relatively arid environment, and the eucalyptus trees are well adapted to that environment, and they were able to increase the foliage in the area. And I think they even sort of got away from them a little bit, and they spread out, and maybe even became a little bit of a plague. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot of eucalyptus up in northern Israel and even into southern Syria and so forth. So
Hmm.
it was brought there by the British in the 19th century. Anyway, that's an aside. So, but the kibbutzim, uh, when I was there in the 1990s, they were still modelled on socialism, but there were a lot of grumbling. There's a lot of grumbling. A lot of them are not as successful as they'd previously been. They were struggling financially, and since that time, in fact, I don't even think you can do what I did so much. You used to be able to go as a foreigner and stay on a kibbutz for a few weeks or a few months or whatever. So you just volunteer your time, and I got a little sort of stipend, monthly, and volunteered my time and worked in a job on the kibbutz, and but I don't know if they even do that so much now because after that, sometime starting in the late 90s, a lot of them transitioned and they introduced things like private property ownership within the kibbutz. So they still exist as kibbutzim, but not the original idea is for most of them has just gone now. A lot of them have effectively converted into a kind of village. So whereas in the past, kibbutzniks would be assigned appropriate premises and say they get married, they get bigger premises. Now they actually have the title to their home in that
Mm.
community. So
Right.
um, yeah. So anyway, and there's even when I was there, actually, a lot of kibbutzniks were living off and working off the kibbutz, and they could stay enrolled in the kibbutz by paying a percentage of their income from the outside world to the kibbutz, 10% or whatever it was, and that gave them the opportunity to return if they wanted and vote and so forth.
Mm.
But by the time I was there, yeah, there were already a lot of kibbutzniks living off the kibbutz. There were quite a few people brought in from the outside with specialist skills and so forth. So it was already pretty clear that the original kibbutz process was breaking down. The original socialism had failed.
Hmm.
Anyway, and as I said, about 5 years after I left, a lot of them started to convert into villages effectively. So I don't, yeah, maybe you can still go as a volunteer, but I'd heard that a lot of that had been curtailed.
Hmm.
Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting example because the children's houses were an attempt. They were reading the Marxist literature, and there was an attempt to bring about this sort of reduction, maybe not complete destruction, but reduction in the
Hmm.
importance of the nuclear family, and it failed abysmally.
Hmm. Right.
So, um, nuclear families are important. Nuclear families are particularly important
Mm.
in our society. And it's absolutely, it's no conspiracy theory because you can go back and you can read what they've written on it. There's plenty of, we've got this on Wiki for Men, and there are plenty of other places. Many feminist leaders have explicitly said they wanted to destroy the family, wanted to destroy the family. And yeah, Marxist leaders also said they want to destroy the family. I won't sort of repeat quotes or anything because
Yeah.
they're widely circulated, but
Yeah.
they're all around. We've got them. These are well verified. We go to a lot of trouble to verify the quotes that are on Wiki for Men and A Voice for Men. So anyway,
Hmm.
uh, yeah, there it is. The nuclear family, very important, and continues to be under attack.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The idea that you're tying yourself to your own children seems to be anathema to the left in general, it appears,
Mm.
or any kind of collectivist. It's kind of this idea that you don't have any kind of say in your own lineage, but everybody else gets to have a say, but not you who made the generation.
Isn't that interesting? That's right. There are all these other people saying the people who are running the children's houses, for example, have a huge influence on the children. Why do they get to have an influence and
Exactly.
their own
Yeah.
parents don't? Exactly, that's right.
Hmm.
And in actual fact, of course, just to make comment a little bit more on this, this is something, of course, that had been noticed even quite early. 1984 by George Orwell, one of my favorite books, talks about this, of course, and he talks about they do live in nuclear families in 1984, in the world of 1984. But if I seem to remember, there was some reference in the book saying that they were eventually going to try to eliminate the nuclear family. And in the meantime, they turned all the children into spies against their own parents,
Hmm.
which had broken the trust and the love in the family. So they had already effectively damaged the family already. But I think that they were eventually going to try to eliminate it completely.
Hmm.
Anyway, so this was Orwell in the 1940s writing this. So he had realized this, and he of course was living in the wake of Nazi Germany and watching the Soviet Union as well, and where these things did happen, where children did inform on their parents.
Right.
So yeah, so it's been noticed for a long time, and it's unfortunate that they've been able to do as much damage as they have to the nuclear family.
Hmm.
But I do think people are waking up about it.
Yes.
So I do have a few other things I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk a little bit about Western liberal democracy,
Okay.
and this is something that comes up a lot. But I think it's under attack again. It's always under attack, and we always have to
Yeah.
be mindful of this.
Hmm.
Um, the there's definitely and we've talked about this sort of thing before, but I just want to reiterate it. There's real growing problems with authoritarianism within Western society, intolerance to alternative viewpoints, demanding, orthodoxy and insist and demanding what people and limiting what others can and cannot say.
Hmm.
And I just want to remind everybody that Western liberal democracy is a very, very recent invention, 100, years old, along that line. And it gradually evolved, right? Really, by the late 19th century, it was in fact, Australia and New Zealand were among the first places who started introducing, say, universal manhood suffrage and universal suffrage and so forth, and not tying voting to property ownership.
Hmm.
But uh, if we don't defend it, it could disappear and end up being a footnote in history. And I'm with Winston Churchill, who said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all of the others. At least that's attributed to him.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's not to say that it doesn't have some pretty serious problems, but I think all the other forms of government, I suspect, are worse. And this, by the way, is why I don't support removing suffrage from any group of people.
Sure.
So I know, there've been a few people who, for example, have pushed, although there's no realistic chance of this happening, have argued in favour of removing women's suffrage, for example. And I think
Hmm.
that, and if you can remove it from one group of people, you can remove it from another group of people. So I think the only defence we have is ultimately to accept that all adults of sound mind must have the vote, but accepting that that's going to come with a price. And I'm not going to pretend that I know how to fix that because we know what's happened in recent decades and a lot of the problems that have come about in the West. But we've got to find some way of solving this that doesn't involve taking people's votes away.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the other side will just end up taking their votes away
Yeah.
later.
Hmm. Right, right. Well, the thing is, I know the common argument is that, women have kind of screwed things up, and therefore it was the women's vote that was the problem. But I do think that rests on a a lack of expectation for women to ever be accountable, I think. So
Mm,
I think, now that women do have the vote, I think trying to kind of get women to change their ways and adopt a more enlightened set of viewpoints, non-gynocentric viewpoints. I know it's a hard sell, it's a big task. But
mm.
I think that is more the priority we need to kind of spending our energy on instead of any kind of voting rights repeal.
100%.
Right, and I understand the other point in that uh, the women's vote was practically given to them on a whim and so forth. But I think we're kind
Mm,
of
mm.
well into it right now that I think we kind of it's kind of strange to kind of go back and use really uh, out there arguments like the repeal.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
mm, so,
And as part of that, of course, as you know, I support all adults who are able-bodied. If the state needs it and needs conscription, I believe that all the adults who are able-bodied should bear that responsibility, which means men and women combined. And that
right.
goes along with it so as well. As you say, the way in which the vote was probably implemented, women's suffrage was implemented, was probably almost a bit haphazard.
Well, yeah.
It was implemented without necessarily having the same responsibilities as men being introduced at the
Mhm.
same time, which
Right.
is really,
Right.
if I was going to do it, that's how I would do it. I would
Sure.
introduce the rights and responsibilities together and make it clear that they're tied to one another.
Yeah, right. Well, another thing that I've kind of tilt my head at those who want to take away the women's vote per se is that it weren't didn't if men gave women the vote, weren't they just as unreliable in terms of voting as the women are? Because
As in by making that choice, you mean? Yes, that's right.
right, right,
Yes.
right. Because
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, if they were voting on behalf of the women, then I don't think this
Yes.
really makes much of a difference.
Yes, and this is actually a really good point. That
Uh,
in reality, votes before women's suffrage were actually more like family votes. The head of the family had the vote, and we know this
yeah,
is the case. It's not necessarily universally true, but we know this is particularly the case in the UK, for example, where in cases where where there was no man in the family, like he died or something, the
yeah,
woman did indeed. have the vote,
Mm,
suggesting it was in fact a family vote, and whoever was considered the head of the
right.
family had the vote. And I suppose from the point of view of the 19th century society, that probably was much easier to manage because the number of people involved was relatively small. It would have been
Mm,
significantly smaller as well. And just to
right.
reiterate, this is something we've talked about here, and I've talked about it a lot in different forums. Women absolutely voted before universal women's suffrage in the UK in
Right.
particular. We know this for
Mm,
sure. The evidence isn't strong in other places, but I wouldn't be terribly surprised if it happened. But in the UK, we know for sure it definitely happened
mm,
because women's names appear on voter rolls going right back to the early 19th century and even late 18th century and so forth. So some women in the UK voted before most men, for example.
mm,
And that was
yeah.
because they were property owners and considered the heads of family, and therefore they
Mm,
voted if they were a widow or
mm,
whatever it happened to be.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And they weren't all aristocrats too. One of the interesting discoveries within the last 20 years is that it previously been thought most women who voted were probably a fairly wealthy and perhaps aristocratic, and it turned out they found a voter roll that had several middle class women and a maid on it.
Mm,
So
yeah.
you
Yeah.
didn't, yeah, just because they owned property. So
Right. Yeah. Yes. So when we're talking about the democracy, the liberal democracy, as we're talking about, we're talking about voting on some of the more important political sort of changes as opposed to voting on another man's freedom, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, sorry. I'm also
Yeah.
I want to clarify. We're talking about representative
Mm.
democracy.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Perfect. Yeah.
That's right. And our
Mm.
and our what we have is not perfect in terms of the system,
Mm.
but it's a good. You make a good point there about yeah, that's
Mm.
right. Voting on another man's freedom. A good example, of course, is conscription, where only perhaps a minority of the population are involved. And we saw this in Switzerland recently, where they have direct democracy. Not they obviously they have parliamentary democracy, but they have a
Mm.
lot of referendums and for all sorts of things. And they had one on abolishing male conscription, and a majority of women voted in favour of retaining male conscription
Oh, of course.
because that's how, yeah, whereas a minority of men
Yeah.
voted in favour. I believe if only men had voted in that, it would have been abolished.
Mm.
So, yeah, but that's, of course, yeah, an example of that, of precisely that, the people who were not, who themselves did not have that obligation, were able to vote on others having that obligation.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's not
Exactly.
perfect,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
I think and it is relatively young. So I think we really need to continue on the way of Western liberal democracy, refine it, make it better. We've made mistakes along the way, improve it, but I'm really concerned that it may be swept aside with growing authoritarianism uh, in the West, which is primarily but not exclusively among people I would call woke.
Hmm.
They're very much willing to tell others what they can and can't say, and they seem to envision themselves in charge, being able to pontificate and decide what is and is not orthodoxy. So as I keep saying, just because they think they're going to be in charge doesn't mean that they will be. History has shown that many of the leaders of revolutions didn't end up running the show in the end. So a
Hmm.
lot of
Yeah.
the leaders of revolutions were actually denounced by their own
Yeah.
revolutions. So
Sure.
I think yeah, these people are always envision themselves being on top, and I'm not so sure that's how it's going. Even if they did
Hmm.
win, I'm not sure that's how
Yeah.
it would work out actually. So
Yeah.
yeah, be careful what you wish for.
Exactly, and it is true that the woke are the loudest voices in this kind of what I would even call this almost vigilante authoritarianism,
Mm,
because it is sort of like a mob and the ones that are pulling the strings kind of colluding into kind of taking our freedoms away. But I am sometimes disappointed by the conservative side and their reliance on state solutions as opposed to,
mm,
allowing, more freedom to actually defend your homes or protect your boundaries and so forth. Just more, liberty-based solutions, I think, is better. But I think in this day and age, they kind of seem to think that we're past that or something like
yeah,
that.
it's
I
kind of
think
like
that's
a lot of them
that.
are
Yeah.
top-down solutions, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I have a hard time kind of getting on board with a lot of what they have to say, but I guess we'll see how this pans out. I'm just kind of worried that allegiance to one side blinds them to certain problems.
Yeah, and I'm seeing we're seeing this problem. Excuse me, we're seeing this problem from both sides.
Hmm.
So, and this is what, and I noticed too that people on each side tend to recognize if you talk to them and you say, "Oh, I'm seeing this problem on the other side," they'll
Hmm.
enthusiastically agree with you, right? But if you say, "Actually, I'm seeing it on your side as well," oh no, 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 it's not happening here.
Yeah.
So this, yes,
Right. Hmm.
this is the part of the problem, not the only problem, but
Hmm.
it's part of the problem. So, from my perspective, it's we're seeing authoritarianism growing on both sides. Probably the left a little bit more advanced at the moment,
Hmm. Yeah.
but that doesn't mean they won't be overtaken by the right at some point.
Okay,
So,
yeah, yeah. Well,
yeah,
the left have a interesting weapon because they always profess to be the anti-fascist and the
mm,
anti-authoritarianism. So they have this kind of this big shield because they can't nothing we're not the authoritarians. Nothing we do is authoritarianism,
yeah.
even though in actual
Well,
practice it
anti-authoritarian.
absolutely is. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Yes. So I just
Right.
wanted to mention that, and it is something that I will continue to mention. I did want to
Yes.
make one small personal comment, an anecdote.
Hmm.
Of course, it's no great secret of the fact that I'm a Linux user and have been for
Hmm.
decades,
Yes.
desktop Linux user. On a Linux mailing list, I mentioned this very concept about how Western liberal democracy might only be a flash in the pan. About 20 years ago, I mentioned it on a mailing list. I shocked a lot of people by mentioning it. And back then, even I didn't really think it was a serious problem. We had to, like, we've got to
Hmm.
be mindful, but, mindful of this, but there's probably no direct threat, right? Now, of course, 20 years later, I think that there is a direct threat. But I think it was quite amusing that 20 years ago, I did shock a lot of people on a Linux mailing list by mentioning this in an off-topic discussion.
Hmm.
So,
Sure.
anyway, so there we are.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, one more thing before you move on is that
Mm.
um, uh, the thing about authoritarianism and why we actually have to be careful about it, it's not respect for authority, where authority
Mm.
is like say like any given kind of authority, like say the authority to my own property or to the children under my care, hypothetically speaking, or
Yeah,
like or certain things like uh, general law and order and so forth. Authoritarianism
yeah,
is about the primacy of that over an individual's rights.
yes, that's
Right.
right.
So I don't
Exactly.
think there. So this is not something you can put a barometer to and call it
Mm.
in any way good. It's like, if
That's
there
a
is
very good point.
authoritarianism, it's more of a there it is instead of let's tone it down this much. No, 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 this much. No,
Yeah,
it's not something that there's an acceptable amount of. Exactly. And I already said it's not the same as the recognition of legitimate authorities, which you can kind of make those kind of speculations about. But yeah, that's so it's
that
wrong to say we
is.
need some authoritarianism. That's just wrong.
Yeah, I agree. That is a really good point, actually. That's right, because adhering to authority, lawfully enacted authority, is not authoritarianism. The question is, how did that authority get there? And if you
Hmm.
have a democratic society in which the individuals do have recourse if they're wronged, for example,
Hmm.
and those laws were put in by politicians who who are not with, it's not to say they aren't necessarily without undue influence and won't
Hmm.
be biased and so forth, but
Hmm.
nevertheless, it's not intrinsically authoritarian for that to be the case. Yeah, no, I'm glad you
Exactly.
mentioned that actually. Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, sure. I'm sorry to derail you from your next subject, but
no, that's right.
because I'm kind of like thinking more on this. It's like
Mm,
because if the state enacts authoritarian any kind of policies, depending on the society, like say how technologically advanced it already may be, they'll
mm,
find workarounds to get what they want. So
mm.
there's some kind of equivalent of a black market or something or other. So you can't really
And they
stop
did.
them. Yeah, yeah.
That's
So yeah,
right.
I mean, you'll make it a bit more annoying probably, but
Yeah, and that's a
yeah.
good point. Pretty much every authoritarian society, that's exactly what happens. And in actual fact, in some cases, there is often some level of tacit acceptance by the state because they realise the black market may be supplying things that the system, the official system isn't supplying. So
Right.
there's been quite a few cases, I think, where the black market is accepted if not approved of. Because it may bring more food into the society and stave off hunger and so forth. So, yes, this is a really good point.
Right. Yeah. All right, I'll let you go on to your next subject now.
No, that's all right. That's all
Yeah.
right. So yeah, I guess it will be something that I'll be continuing to mention because I
Mhm.
do think, and I haven't. You notice I haven't defined Western liberal democracy today. We've done it before. I've done it in different forums. Anyone
Mhm.
who wants to
Right.
can find definitions, but I did think it was important
Yeah.
to bring it up and
Right.
yeah, and remind
Yes.
everybody of the importance
Mhm.
of maintaining of a free and fair society. And yes, it isn't to say that we don't have problems in our society, and we know how many men are getting screwed over by for example,
Mhm.
the courts.
Yeah.
But fixing that will happen within the context of that free and fair
Sure.
society.
Yeah. That's very understandable.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to mention a couple of other things I've got here. So I'm going to mention Grace Tame. Now, you may not recall, I think I may have mentioned her before. She's Australian. She originally came to prominence because so there was a one of her teachers um, and her did I mention her last time? I might have mentioned her
I
briefly last time.
don't.
Anyway,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
No worries. That's all right. Yeah, okay, yeah. So, yeah. So, they were having sex, which of course we know in the case when it's the younger boys who are the ones who are the victims. It's statutory rape.
Of
The
course.
man involved, she was about 15, I think. The man involved was convicted. He was a teacher, obviously, which makes it even more serious. He was convicted. Um, she wanted to talk about it, and it turned out I think it may have been in her state only. Or maybe national actually, but she couldn't actually, even though she was the victim, she couldn't reveal her own name. It was an offence to reveal the victim's name, even if you were the victim.
Oh.
So
Okay.
she wanted to talk about it. So she campaigned to get it to have that have that repealed, so the person themselves could essentially come out if they wanted to. So anyway, so she did. Um, and I think really primarily she talked about young girls, okay, but that's not really what I want to talk about with Grace Tame. So it's something interesting happened recently with her. So she's been she's been since coming out publicly, she's become a well-known public figure in Australia. She was Australian of the Year a couple of years ago, actually, and she's become quite divisive. And she's been backing what various. So originally she was talking about sexual assault and so forth, but now she's backing
Mhm.
various woke woke topics and so forth. But where I want to go with this is just something that happened that was very interesting recently. So the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, was being interviewed live, and it was probably a mistake for him to allow himself to get into this situation. I'm sure he's kicking
Okay.
himself for it. But for reference, he's in the centre-left Labor Party, by the way. Anyway, so he was being interviewed on stage, and there were cameras rolling, and they said to him, we're going to hit you up with a series of questions, and we want one-word answers. Well, I think that probably should have been a red
Oh.
flag right there, right? So,
Yeah. Hmm.
so yeah, exactly. So, given that he's actually an experienced politician, I was a little surprised he went for it. But anyway, there you go. He did. So he went. They asked him about a few different people and a few different topics, and he was going quite well. And then they said Grace Tame, and he stopped and he actually thought about it, and then he said difficult, right? And of course, the feminists absolutely exploded, right?
Hmm.
So about calling Grace Tame difficult, and he backtracked later the next day and claimed what he meant was she'd had a difficult life. But of course, that's
Right.
I'd suggest that's neither
Yeah.
what he meant
You know,
nor what it
I
sounded like.
I would have went with difficult to answer. Oh.
Different. Nice, nice. Yes, better answer actually than his.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. So anyway, so now you've got Grace Tame saying, yeah, yeah, I'm difficult. I am difficult. You've got you've got
Right.
Greens politicians saying, oh yes, it's perfectly okay
Mm,
for women to be difficult. Um, and so this anyway. But what I find, I guess, kind of amusing about all this, aside from the fact that the Prime Minister put his foot in his mouth rather badly,
hmm
is that it's actually something we can agree on with the feminists that they are difficult. They're
Yeah.
just very and a lot of the prominent feminists are very unlikable people. They really are.
Oh yeah. Right.
And that so they tend to contend that this is a desirable characteristic. I actually disagree with that, and I think that
hmm
them being difficult in general probably make things harder for themselves.
hmm
Right. But I just want to come out and openly say that yes, I absolutely agree they are difficult, right? In terms of
Exactly. Yeah.
and in many cases
Right.
unlikable people. And I'm sure they're not going to disagree with me because
hmm
that's the position they're taking at the moment, that they are difficult
hmm
and prickly and probably I think would be fair they would agree unlikable. So anyway. So
Exactly.
I just thought I'd mention that, or
Right.
Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, putting his foot in it, and them all admitting to, or prominent feminists admitting to being unlikable and difficult, and prickly and unlikable. So anyway, there we have
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yes.
So there you go. Something we can agree on. We don't like them, and they because they're unlikable, and they agree they're unlikable. There we go.
Right. hmm Yes.
So if you ever see them trying to, if we call them unlikable and they did, and they disagree with that, let's point back to this and go, actually, there were prominent
Mhm.
feminists saying that you are in fact all unlikable. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah, and difficult.
hmm
Yeah. So I was going to mention a story from my 20s, and then Bleakley uh, goes into a story from World War II.
Okay.
Not that I was alive during World War II, but these two, when the story I'm about to tell reminded me of a story that I heard about World War II. So
hmm
I was at a party some when I was in my 20s. I used to go to quite a few parties actually, but anyway, there I was at a party, and there was um, this lady I knew. I knew her, and she lived with her sister. I didn't really know the sister. Anyway, this lady was going out with somebody I knew, so I was friends with both of them, right? And I'd been invited to this party, and I met the sister, and the sister um, made it clear she was interested in me, but I flatly knocked her back, right?
Sure.
But for a reason that I'm getting to. Okay, she was actually moderately attractive, pretty attractive. Maybe if it hadn't been for this reason, maybe I would have been interested. I was single, but the reason I knocked her back is because earlier that night, I had seen something on her wall that was written by her, a poem, and the poem was very disturbing. And
Okay.
if everybody carried a camera, I would have taken it in those days in the 90s. I would have taken a picture of it, but unfortunately we
hmm
didn't. So there's no
Right.
picture. But yeah, sorry to gross everyone out, but I'm going to talk about this poem.
All right.
So the poem involved creating a lampshade out of a scrotum. And there was her name at the bottom.
hmm
So I, of course, turned her down flatly when later on she expressed
Yeah.
interest in me. And maybe a week, this was decades ago now, but a week or two later, the guy I knew, remember, it's a man, remember the sister and the boyfriend who I knew, the boyfriend just happened to be hanging out with him, and he said, so why did you turn her down? And I said, did you see the poem? And he said, no. Funny, because he actually went over to he'd been, staying at his girlfriend's place, but apparently he'd
hmm
missed the poem. So I said, look at the poem. And he looked at the poem later on and he said, oh, I see what you mean. When we met again later, I said, I see what you
Okay.
mean. I went to another party there, I don't know, a couple of months later or
hmm
something. The poem was gone.
Okay.
Anyway, so the message got back and the poem got removed. But hopefully she learned something. You can't just write stuff like that, and actions have consequences. Anyway,
Exactly. Right.
right. So, but at the time, the poem reminded me of something. I don't know if
Hmm.
you know this story, but there's actually a story about a lampshade made of human skin from World War II.
I've heard of stories like that. Yeah.
Right. So some people say it's an urban legend, but there's some evidence to suggest that it did actually exist.
Mhm.
There was probably only one. So I've heard people claim that there were lots of them. That's almost certainly not the case. But there was a woman by the name of Ilsa Koch, and she worked at a concentration camp. And there is evidence to suggest that she actually had a lampshade made out of human skin from victims of one of the death camps in
Mhm.
Nazi. This is in Nazi
Yeah.
Germany, obviously, right?
Hmm.
Um, Apparently, uh, again, it's all sort of fairly, not very clear what a lot of the details, but there's some evidence to suggest that some senior Nazis heard about the existence of this thing and actually ordered it destroyed because even they realized how that would play in the foreign media. So that may explain why so many people think it didn't exist because it probably didn't exist for very long. But as I said, there is some evidence to suggest Ilse Koch actually created one of these things or had one of these things created, but but it was probably destroyed fairly quickly
Hmm.
because even senior Nazis realized that that wasn't going to play very well in the international press.
Right.
Anyway, yeah. So when I saw this thing, that's what I thought of. So obviously,
Hmm.
so
Right.
I mean, maybe that's what she intended. It was a lampshade after all. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. I gather she'd had a bad breakup with a boyfriend or something. I don't
Hmm.
care.
Hmm.
That was horrible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, it disappeared. Yeah.
Hmm.
After so. Anyway, don't tell too many stories about myself, but I was thinking about this one recently, and I thought I'd just mention it. So,
Okay. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I would say I wasn't red pilled in my 20s, which was the 90s, but I'd say I was 80% of the way there.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, you had some common sense is probably the best thing. But
And
but you
and
know,
uh,
yeah.
I just wanted to treat everyone equally, and I think this is inappropriate. And it doesn't
Yeah.
matter that it's, some people would let it pass because it was about a men, about men, but no, not okay. So
Right.
anyway, as I said,
Yeah.
did disappear. I'm sure she still had it, but it was just no longer on the wall. So
Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I'm sure she didn't destroy it, but I'm sure it was just put away. But anyway,
Hmm. Yeah. Right.
yeah.
Hmm.
So I've also got great men of history.
Actually, before you
And
get to great men of
yes,
history, I do kind of want to circle back on this. So, we could be disturbed all we want about that kind of weird poem and so forth, so like that.
mm,
But in places like the United States, as we have many times mentioned, we still have things like foreskins as facial creams.
yes, we
And
do
yeah, yeah,
throughout the West.
and such like that. Maybe even as keepsakes. And so there's male genital parts are still playthings, especially if they're of a certain young age. So
Yes,
let's not forget that there's a lot to be disturbed about, but people simply are not. So yeah,
yes, that's right. And a lot of people, when you talk about, say, women's facial creams being made from foreskin and so forth, a lot of people are in disbelief. But of course, the evidence is there. It's for anyone who wants to look at it.
yeah,
And there have even been celebrities in the US who have explicitly advertised
yeah. They
these
say it
products.
out
Yeah,
loud. Yeah.
they say it out loud. Exactly,
Mhm.
that's right.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So if you're disbelieving at this point, yeah, research it. So we have information. Others do as
Hmm.
well. Yeah,
Hmm.
and
Yes.
as I said, they're just celebrities. I would just say it out loud. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. It's just yeah. Crazy world in some ways, isn't it? We've come so far, and yet we still have so far to go.
Right.
Apparently,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. I mean, just circumcision. I mean, yes. Don't hurt other people unless they're defenseless
Hmm.
neonatal boys, where apparently it's
Right. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, it's crazy.
Exactly. Hmm.
Yeah. Um, so you happy for me to go on with Great Man of
Yes.
History? So
Yes,
I
I
have
am.
picked, cool. So I have picked William Wilberforce. So he was individually a driving force behind the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. And of course, I want to talk a little bit about this. And this is again something we've mentioned before, and I've mentioned in other contexts and so forth, but it's always worth re-mentioning this sort of thing. The Atlantic slave trade. in my opinion, maybe others don't agree with this, but I think it grew out of the Arab slave trade. The Arab slave trade was much older, was taking would take Africans, primarily African men, into Arabia. A lot of them would end up eunuchs and so forth. Whereas the Atlantic slave trade was more gender balanced or even had more women. But
Mm.
in many ways, I think the Atlantic slave trade grew out of the Arab slave trade because the infrastructure in Arabia in Africa was already set up for the Arab slave trade. So for those who don't know, if anyone's watched Roots, okay, which in many ways is a good show because a good miniseries because it talks about the slavery through several generations, and I think
Mhm.
in many ways it's really well done. But there is a. Have you seen Roots, by the way?
I know what you're talking about,
Okay, yeah.
but I had not actually seen it.
Cool. Sorry, you just froze a little bit for me there. What was the last bit of what you said?
Sorry. What I was saying is that I know what Roots is, but I've never seen it.
University. Okay, no worries. I do recommend it if you can. It's interesting. It's a good show in many ways, but
Yeah.
there are some inaccuracies, and one
Mhm.
inaccuracy is that it shows. Now, it's been a long time since I saw it too, but based on
Mhm.
my recollection, one inaccuracy is that it shows essentially Americans going into Africa and snatching people. I seem to recall an elder in the African village noting this as a problem and saying we're not really sure why this is occurring, which that's complete nonsense. Everybody knew what was going on, and in actual fact, most of that idea of snatches, while those raids did occasionally occur, they were
Mhm.
far and away the rarest way it occurred because it was actually pretty dangerous for the people going in. So they didn't want to do that. There's a much more effective method, which is what they would use, which is that they would negotiate with local kings, and the local
Mhm.
kings would sell off their own undesirables. So if you're a criminal or you're a political undesirable, I mean, hey, from the king's point of view, you get rid of your undesirables and they give you money. I mean, it's a win-win, right?
Right.
So also captured enemy soldiers from neighboring tribes, they were also sold off. So you can kind of see the trend. Anybody who's,
Mhm.
is for one reason or another undesirable. They're foreigners who tried to invade and captured, or maybe in some cases that they would raid into another kingdom, snatch people, and then sell them off into slavery. That happened. So, and this was happening. People were being sold into Arabia, and people were being sold then later into the Americas and elsewhere. So, um, but anyway, so that's specifically the Atlantic slave trade, and but anyway, Wilberforce. Uh, he was a major driver in trying to abolish the Atlantic slave trade. He actually came to this kind of later in life. He became more religious later on, and
Mhm.
it came from a religious basis that he believed that this was morally and fundamentally wrong and needed to be stopped. And he actually campaigned for quite a long time. So he actually he so I think it was 1786 which I think what he would have been, yeah, 29. 1786 was when he first started advocating to abolish it. He was a parliamentarian. He came from a fairly wealthy merchant's family, so he was a commoner, but fairly wealthy, which probably is probably pretty much everybody in the British Parliament at the time, Westminster. But he was he was a parliamentarian. He introduced a bill in 1789. Sorry, 1789. Yeah, 1789. He started a campaign in the Parliament to abolish it. Introduced a bill in 1791, which failed 163 to 88. So about a third of the people agreed with him in Parliament at the time. Tried again in 1793. The bill was defeated by 8 votes. But after 1800, there seems to have been a lot more public support. There was a sort of shift in public opinion, and there was a lot more support for the abolition of the slave trade.
Mhm.
And finally, in 1807, a bill was introduced, interestingly, not by Wilberforce himself, but by others. But he was credited as the real driving force behind this movement.
Mhm.
And it passed 283 to 16, and the British abolished the Atlantic slave trade. But what's particularly interesting about this is, of course, this is the British Parliament, so they've only abolished it for Britain, okay?
Mhm. Yeah.
But the key here is the Royal Navy was so powerful at the time that essentially by deciding not to uh, um, not to support or to oppose the Atlantic slave trade, they were effectively abolishing it for other countries as well. And that's exactly what they did. They actually had a squadron based in Africa, and they would try to intercept slaving ships. And I mean, it's the 19th century, and the approach they took probably wasn't perfect. There were problems. If they did intercept a slaving ship, they would then attempt to return the freed slaves to Africa. But of course, what do you do with them? Because if you return them to their home country, there's every possibility they'll be recaptured and returned into slavery. So what they would often do, not exclusively, what they would often do is they would send them to Sierra Leone, and Wilberforce actually had a stake in creating Sierra Leone as well. But they would send them to Sierra Leone. The United States, of course, later had an equivalent country, Liberia. I'm sure you've heard of,
Yeah,
know
I've
about.
heard of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course, yeah. Anyway, so that caused problems too, and Sierra Leone and Liberia had huge problems in the late 19th, early 20th century, including slavery existing in both societies. Again, unfortunately, but there was a League of Nations group that went to, I think, Liberia and possibly also Sierra Leone in the early 20th century, and they reported slavery being prevalent in the society. Anyway, so it was far from a perfect solution, but at least it was an attempt to resolve the problem. But
Hmm.
yeah, the power of the Royal Navy effectively meant that they were able to essentially enforce this. And of course, later on, the British abolished slavery. The United States obviously abolished slavery as well. The
Yeah.
Brazilians did in the 1880s.
Hmm.
And I think was it 1982 was the last country to actually abolish slavery, even
Hmm.
though there were countries that still weren't enforcing it.
Yeah.
And where we are today is that there are more people enslaved than at any point in human history as
Hmm.
of today.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, as a proportion of the population, it's quite small because there are so many
Right.
humans alive today. However, there are an estimated 50 million people enslaved today. So
Hmm.
while abolishing the Atlantic slave trade and making slavery progressively illegal over 150 years or so was all fantastic and did make things better,
Hmm.
there are still a lot of people enslaved.
Right.
And in particular, and this doesn't get much airtime, there are a lot of men enslaved. So
Well, yeah.
yeah. So the women enslaved do get when the UN talks about it at all, it's usually about the women who are enslaved, and even the UN doesn't talk about it probably as nearly as much as it probably should.
Hmm.
But the men enslaved, there are men enslaved all around the world, doing predominantly agricultural labor and so forth.
Yeah.
Just like happened 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago. Same
Hmm.
in many cases, the same sort of thing. Manual labor they're being forced to do. There's one particular one that is is rare, it's hardly known, and I do try to mention it. There's a problem in Thailand and maybe some other countries in the region
Hmm.
where there are large fishing fleets, and these fishing fleets go out and they get fish and seafood and whatnot to sell into countries like Australia and Canada and New Zealand and so forth,
Yep.
countries that can afford the lobster and whatnot.
Yeah.
These fleets have a huge problem with slavery. So there are what they will do is there'll be men from poorer countries will go to Thailand looking for work. They don't know anybody. They maybe don't speak the language. They'll be snatched. They'll be chained to a ship. Okay. And in some cases, they actually don't see land for years.
Mm.
And the way that works is that these little fishing boats are actually resupplied at sea by sort of larger motherships, if you could almost call them that. And these guys some of them, well, obviously while they're working, they can't be chained. But once they're out at sea, they'll unchain them then, but they're kilometers or miles out to the ocean, right? There's no escape on off this little fishing boat. And when the supply ships come up to restock the fishing boats, so they don't have
Mhm.
to return to shore, they'll chain them to the deck, so they can't even get onto the resupply boats. There are actual documented cases of these guys who have finally got out of it, and they didn't see land for 3, 4 years in some
Mhm.
cases
Right.
because the little fishing boats. And so the supply ships will put the food on, take the catch off, and the fishing boat just stays operational. Even change crews and
Yeah.
all sorts of things out to sea, and they don't return to shore very often.
Mm.
So these guys are stuck out there for years and years and years, and it's hardly any airtime at all. I've tried to mention it periodically. Honestly, probably not enough. I should mention it more often, but and raise more awareness. but they're out there right now, and hardly anybody cares.
Right. Well, I got a bit of a theory as to why it's so prevalent right now, even though people may not, understand this. And I guess that has to do with the fact that, our mindset right now is, rightly that slavery is wrong. People are, as individuals, should be treated equally.
Yes.
So it is that disbelief that kind of shields their eyes from this kind of stuff. This possibly couldn't possibly happen. This kind of gets what I would personally call red marketed into like a hidden situation in which this kind of stuff runs rampant. So yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah,
you're
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I have encountered that disbelief in other contexts as well. You're right. There is actually a phenomenon where people, if they're confronted with an idea which is simply too unbelievable from their knowledge, they'll just ignore it.
All right. Yeah.
So yeah, and that could be what's happening here. I hadn't thought about
Right.
that actually, right?
Yeah.
Because I've told people
Well,
about this, and they
yeah.
don't seem outraged. They should be outraged. They're probably it's that phenomenon. They're just ignoring it.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're not seeing it in the open, right? They're not pe seeing people in public, legally or whatever,
So you've
in
you've
chain.
actually frozen from.
Oh, did I? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
it
Go
says
on.
my internet connection is unstable.
Uh,
Am I
I'm
here
hoping at
still?
your end it'll. I'm hoping because we do the recording from Vernon's end, so I'm hoping at Vernon's end it's all okay. I can hear you and see you, and it seems to be back to normal now. But there was a bit of a little bit of a problem there.
Okay, well, I'll try not to be too long-winded, but what I was saying is that people aren't publicly working in chains as slaves out in the open. So
Mm.
this is fine. It's kind of similar to the idea of wars and how sanitized there are, and that's why wars kind of just kind of seem to be happening here or there, and we're not as shocked about it. So 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 there's
There have
that's kind of
been.
a like a bit of a side effect of some of these improvements that we can't we're not saying roll back the improvements, but we got to
Mm.
kind of work out these bugs in post. To put it mildly,
Yeah,
it's
there are
it's
still some cases where, for example, chattel slavery, where men are sold on the auction block. That has happened. In Libya, we saw that after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, there were cases where that occurred.
Mhm.
I don't know if it occurred before when he was in power, but certainly since he lost power and died, there were cases, and there are parts of Africa where you can see slaves in the field, but it's mostly out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, did you have anything else? This is kind of making me nervous. The connection here,
Oh yes, all
it's
right.
yeah.
So we can limit things, and I can always uh, continue next time. So I just wanted to mention, yeah, about the large number of people, and particularly men and boys, who are enslaved today.
Yeah,
I did have a man of note
yeah. Let's do that.
in the book. Okay, all right, and then
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Zoe McClellan. Okay,
That's fine.
right. Right. So I've got it's in some ways it's easier to find. I guess the threshold is lower. A man of note are easy to find. The great men of history. I probably spend a bit more time on it, but there's some great guys who. Just a reminder to be a man of note doesn't necessarily reach the standard of one of the great men of history, but they've done something pretty amazing. So today I want to talk about Stanislav Petrov, and he's one of two Russian officers I'm going to talk about. Next time I'll talk about a different Russian officer. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, and in 1983 he was in charge of a remote listening post in, I think, Siberia, if I understand correctly. And his listening post detected an incoming ballistic missile from the United States, just a single missile.
Hmm.
And he judged that the United States would not launch a single missile, and therefore decided it had to be some sort of computer or problem or detection problem, and he did not pass it on to his superiors. He was right, by the way. It was some sort of it was a detection problem, but at the time the Soviet leadership was very very twitchy on the trigger, and there was some concern that had he, or more than concern, it's believed that if he passed on this information to his superiors, they may well have perceived it as a nuclear attack from the United States and responded. with a nuclear attack, and that's considered to be being a realistic possibility. So Stanislav Petrov effectively, it would appear, saved the world,
Mm.
and he was not recognised until for a long time afterwards. So I just want to mention him just very briefly and say that I think he's one of two Soviet officers. I said I'll be mentioning another one next time. You can read quite a lot about him. There's a lot's been talked about him, but I think it was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that information really came out about this. So yeah, just amazing what he did. And just by oh yeah, he got punished for it, by the way.
Oh
So
yeah.
he had, you know, under the rules of engagement, he had to pass that information on. So he was breaking the rules, and he did get punished for it. But yeah, this is the case to be made that he actually saved the world and avoided
Mm.
a nuclear attack. So this was 1982, 83. I'll just briefly mention too. A lot of people don't know this, but the period 1982, 1983. What year were you born, Vernon, if you don't mind me asking?
1989.
Okay, no worries, cool. So I was born in 1972.
Hmm.
So I was around for this, 10, 11 years old. And it wasn't really widely known at the time. In fact, probably not even until after the fall of the Soviet Union. But 82, 83 was actually a really dangerous time. People talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This period was just as dangerous. And this was right when this problem occurred and when Stanislav didn't pass on the information. And this is why so many these people, it might sound crazy though to think that the Soviets would have thought that was a nuclear attack. This period, the Soviet leadership in this 1982, 1983 period, they were really twitchy and really paranoid. Several things happened. There was only a few weeks before, a Korean Airlines flight had been shot down by a Soviet pilot. And around about the same time, haven't actually checked the specific dates, but there was a military maneuver by the name of Able Archer. And Able Archer uh, actually was a major Western military maneuver to sort of test European preparedness for a ground war in case the Soviet Union invaded. But the Soviet leadership believed it was a ruse and that the Americans were going to attack as a result of Able Archer. So this is the kind of things going on in this period, 1982, 1983, right when Stanislav Petrov did make the right call and didn't pass on the information and probably saved the world. Because honestly, the Soviet leadership in that period were bordering on paranoia, and it was very, very dangerous. So,
Mm.
yeah. So I want to say thanks for, from behalf of everyone to Stanislav.
Hmm.
Amazing thing. Anyways, yeah, 1939 to 2017. So he passed away in 2017. But anyway,
Exactly.
yeah. But it's just that right at that period is when it happened. Right when that, if it had been a couple of years later, maybe it wouldn't have mattered as much. But right at that moment was when that issue occurred. So anyway,
Yes.
so that's yeah. So he's my man of note,
Absolutely.
and I will.
Well, it's kind of amazing, that not even the crushing boot of Soviet Russia could, break a man's spirit, to make
Right,
this kind
and
of an initiative for sure.
that's right. His good sense, exactly.
Yeah,
That's right. That's
exactly.
right. That's
Yeah,
right. It's right. His intelligence and his good sense
mhm.
transcended
Yes,
everything. That's right. Exactly. Despite
absolutely.
the
So, yeah.
yeah, because that's right. The Soviet Union really did try to destroy individual initiative and all sorts of things. I
Hmm.
mean, the miniseries Chernobyl is great to watch. I mean, again, some people have questioned some aspects of it, but I think it really portrays that Soviet mindset very, very well, where nobody wants to make a decision and nobody wants to take responsibility. And of course,
Exactly.
that was that. So him, that's right. He transcended that and he took responsibility and paid a price for it too.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I just want to mention Zoe McClellan
All right.
before. Yeah. As of March 2026, a warrant is outstanding for the arrest of Zoe McClellan in relation to charges of kidnapping, child stealing, and child custody deprivation. McClellan is a public figure who has appeared in numerous popular television shows, including Star Trek Voyager, JAG, NCIS New Orleans, and Designated Survivor. Her face is familiar to millions. It is extraordinary that she has evaded detection for so long. McClellan was reportedly residing in an apartment in River Ridge, Louisiana in April 2021 and may still be residing in the area. McClellan grew up in the area of Port Orchard, Washington State, and may have returned to the area. Some sources believe that McClellan has left the United States and is residing in Canada or Costa Rica. Prior to disappearing, McClellan was known to use the alias Sarah Chandler. Anyone with any relevant information should contact the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Thank you.
All right. I'll catch you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.